Teller County, Colorado Territory, June 1889. The morning Carl Brenner drove a wooden stake into the center of what would become his cabin floor, three men on horseback stopped at the property line and watched him do it. They didn't call out. They didn't wave. They simply sat their horses in the early summer heat and studied the German stonemason crouched over that single point of ground, not a corner, not a wall line, not any position that made sense to anyone who had ever built anything in America. And then they looked at each other without speaking and rode on. Whatever explanation existed for what they had witnessed, they decided it was not one they needed to hear. The stake stood 14 inches tall, sharpened pine driven flush to the dry Colorado earth with a single stone Carl had carried from the creek bed that morning. He had measured the site 4 times before placing it. The cabin footprint was 20 feet square. He had walked the perimeter, counted his paces, halved them, and driven the stake into the exact mathematical center of what would become a room where he and his wife would eat and sleep and survive whatever the mountains sent down from the Wyoming line. The stake marked nothing structural. The roof would not rest on it. No beam would connect to it. It served no load-bearing function that any American builder of 1889 would have recognized. What it marked was the origin point of a heating system that would still be warm at dawn, 12 hours after the last flame died. Carl straightened from his crouch and looked at the stake for a long moment. He was 42 years old, built the way men are built when they have spent 30 years lifting stone, not large and waxy, but dense as though the material had worked its way into him over time and made itself permanent. His hands were gray at the knuckles from granite dust that no amount of washing had fully removed. He had first picked up a mason's chisel at 11 in a village in the Black Forest region of southwestern Germany, where his father had handed it to him without ceremony and said, "Watch where I put my hands, not the stone. The stone does not change. Your hands do." His father, Heinrich Brenner, had been a Kakelofen builder. The word did not translate cleanly into English, and Carl had stopped trying years ago. What it described was a craftsman who constructed the massive ceramic and brick stoves that had heated German homes for 5 centuries, monuments of fired clay and dense stone, sometimes weighing 2 tons or more, designed around a principle so straightforward it had survived unchanged since medieval Bavarian winters. You burned wood once intensely for 2 hours in the morning. The mass absorbed the energy. The mass held it. The mass released it slowly through the hours that followed, warming the room, not from a single point, but from a central source that radiated outward in every direction with equal generosity. One fire, one day of warmth. No midnight refueling, no waking to a dead stove in a cabin that had become an icebox by 4 in the morning. Heinrich had explained the principle while they were laying the base of a new unit in a merchant's house. One November, Carl, perhaps 13, mixing mortar in the yard while frost formed on the wooden bucket handle. Iron forgets heat in an hour. Stone remembers heat for a day. The more stone you give it, the longer it remembers. A fire against a wall heats one direction, and the wall takes half of what you offer it. But a fire wrapped entirely around stone heats the stone from every side at once, and stone standing in the center of a room shares what it holds equally with every corner. No corner suffers. No corner freezes. The geometry does the work so you don't have to. Carl had understood it at 13 the way children understand things their fathers make inevitable, not as a discovery, but as the natural order. He had spent the next 3 decades building on it, refining it, watching his father, and then himself translate the principle into structures that serve families through German winters with a fraction of the fuel that neighboring regions burned. The Kakelofen tradition was not a clever trick. It was a technology refined through 500 years of cold and necessity handed down through craft lineages, the way important knowledge always moves not through books, but through hands. He immigrated to America in 1881, following reports of mining work and construction in the mountain territories. He spent 2 years in Nevada working the silver operations, laying stone foundations for processing facilities, and watching the American workers burn through firewood at a rate that would have seemed catastrophic in any Black Forest village. He moved to Wyoming and built foundations for homestead cabins, watching the families who moved into those homes arrange corner stoves against exterior walls. The worst possible position, bleeding heat directly through the wall to the outside air, and then watch those same families burn wood around the clock through January and February and still wake, shivering in far corners. He said nothing during those years. He was new. He was German. He laid the stone he was paid to lay and kept what he knew in the place where knowledge waits for the right moment. He moved south into Colorado in 1884, following construction work toward the mountain counties. Denver was expanding outward. Teller County was filling with homesteaders, staking claims at high-elevation building, quickly building, practically building, with the conviction that a good corner stove and a sufficient woodpile would manage the winter problem that 9,000 feet of altitude created. Carl watched them build with the quiet frustration of someone who could see both the error and the outcome, but had not yet found the position from which to address either. He met Marta in Denver that same year. She was working in the household of a German-speaking family from Württemberg who had established a dry goods operation on the eastern edge of the city, and she was the kind of woman who could follow a conversation from across a room and tell you afterward which speaker had been lying and which had simply been wrong. She was 38 now to Carl's 42, and she had grown up in the same region he had, not the same village, but close enough that they shared the same winter vocabulary, the same understanding of what cold meant when it stopped being seasonal and became existential, the same instinctive distrust of any heating system that required continuous attention to remain effective. Her father had not been a Katchalofen builder. He had been a farmer who owned one, a massive unit her grandfather had constructed into the central wall of the family farmhouse, tiled in cream ceramic so large it occupied the equivalent of a full wardrobe in floor space, and warmed every adjacent room through the radiating patience of 400 pounds of fired clay. Marta had grown up touching warm tile at midnight. She had grown up with the embedded understanding that warmth was something you could store, not merely something you could generate moment to moment. When Carl explained his plan for the central thermal pillar during the months before they filed their homestead claim in Teller County, she did not ask whether it would work. She asked where exactly the pillar would stand and whether the ring firebox would require clay-fired brick or whether dense fieldstone would serve the same function. What Carl did not yet know, what he would not know until a cold October night the following year, was that Marta's understanding of the subject was not academic. She had been 12 years old when her younger brother died. His name was Peter. He was 9. He had been sleeping in the far room of the family farmhouse on a February night when the woodpile ran short and the fire in the secondary iron stove of that room, not the main Katchalofen which stood in the central hall and would have held its warmth until morning, but a smaller unit that had been added to the far bedroom when the family needed the space went cold sometime between midnight and 3 in the morning. The temperature that night dropped to the kind of cold that finds every gap in every structure and enters with patience and intention. Peter was a sound sleeper. He did not wake when the metal ticked and cooled. He did not feel the temperature dropping because children often experience extreme cold as a deepening of sleep, a heaviness, a stillness that resembles rest and is its opposite. By morning, he was gone. Marta had been the one to go in first. She carried that knowledge the way people carry formative losses, not on the surface, not as a wound that required tending, but as a permanent calibration, an adjustment to how she calculated everything that came after. When Carl drove his stake into the center of the future cabin floor and described 3,000 pounds of granite standing there to hold winter's warmth, Marta did not think about furniture arrangement or what the neighbors would think. She thought about a far corner in Germany and a fire that had no memory, and a cold that had been patient enough to wait for the fuel to run out. She stood beside Carl on that April morning and looked at the stake. He waited for the question he anticipated, not resistance, but the practical intelligence she brought to every plan of his, the mind that found the things he had overlooked. What she said instead was, "Show me where the ring firebox begins." They had spent their first winter in Teller County in a hastily built one-room cabin with a corner stove, and that winter had performed its function as a demonstration. On a midwinter night at 10 below zero, the zone within 4 feet of the northeast stove held perhaps 75 degrees Fahrenheit. The zone at the southwest corner, diagonally opposite where the bed sat against the wall, held between 26 and 30 degrees. The same room, the same fire. A temperature difference of nearly 50 degrees between 2 points separated by 20 feet of floor space. They had burned wood continuously from November through March. They had fed the stove at midnight and at 3 in the morning and at dawn, crossing frozen floorboards in the dark, and still they had woken each morning with frost on the inside of the far wall and breath visible from the bed. The woodpile had diminished faster than Carl calculated, By February, he was splitting emergency reserve. By March, he understood in his body what he had always understood in theory: a corner stove at high altitude in a mountain winter was not a heating solution. It was a continuous crisis demanding constant fuel and constant attention to hold off a cold that the geometry of the situation made inevitable regardless of effort. In April, when the last frost released, Carl told Marta without preamble, "We build the pillar this summer, 3 feet in diameter, floor to ceiling, 3,000 pounds of granite at the center of our cabin, a ring of fire at its base. By morning after the first fire, the stone will still be warm." Marta looked at the ground where the cabin would stand and answered, "Show me the ring firebox." Construction began the first week of June. The foundation came first, a circular base 4 feet in diameter, dug 3 feet into the Colorado earth, and packed with compacted gravel and flat stones that Carl set by hand over 2 full days. He explained the reasoning while Marta passed him stones from the pile they had assembled. The pillar would weigh more than 3,000 pounds when complete. Without a foundation that distributed that weight evenly or across undisturbed subsoil, the structure would settle unevenly. In the first year, the mortar joints would open, and what they had built to last 50 years would crack before its second winter. They were not building for January. They were building for the January their grandchildren would face on this same ground. The ring firebox took shape above the foundation across the following week. Carl laid fire brick in a circular pattern, creating a combustion channel 8 inches wide and 12 inches tall that wrapped completely around what would become the pillar's lower section. He placed 4 air intake gaps at equal intervals around the circumference, small openings engineered to draw air evenly from all directions and ensure that flames once lit would wrap uniformly around the full perimeter rather than burning aggressively on one side and weakly on the other. The firebox floor he angled slightly inward toward a central cleanout point so that ash would migrate to the middle and could be removed without disturbing the surrounding structure. He tested the draft geometry twice before proceeding, holding a strip of damp cloth near each intake and watching the way the fabric moved. The pillar itself rose from within the ring firebox, and here Carl moved slowly by design. He had sourced dense granite from a quarry 12 miles east of the homestead, driving the wagon there on 3 separate trips over 2 weeks to bring back the right material: close-grained, flat-faced, the kind of rock that produced a clear tone when struck with a chisel, rather than the dull sound of porous material that held air pockets instead of energy. Porous stone meant less thermal mass per cubic inch. Less thermal mass meant shorter memory. He was not selecting for hardness alone. He was selecting for patience. Each course went down in a circular pattern with staggered joints, the same structural principle as brickwork, but executed in irregular natural stone that required each piece to be individually fitted against its neighbor before mortar was applied. The mortar itself was a mixture of clay and lime that Carl had tested in a small temporary kiln behind the cabin site, checking the cured sample for hardness and heat resistance before committing it to the structure. Standard lime mortar cracked under the thermal cycling of repeated heating and cooling. He had watched American masons use it in fireplace construction and then watched the joints open after 2 seasons. Clay held. Clay had held in the Black Forest for generations. Clay would hold in Colorado. Marta worked alongside him from the first day. She mixed mortar in a wooden box, maintaining the correct consistency by feel in a way that required accumulated experience. To calibrate too thin, and it would run from the joints and create weak connections; too thick, and it would not bond cleanly to the irregular stone faces. She carried stone from the yard, selecting pieces Carl had already assessed and marked, bringing them to his position at the pillar's growing circumference. Each granite block weighed between 40 and 60 pounds. By the end of the first week, her hands had developed new calluses over old ones, and she worked without mentioning it. The central flue required the most precise, sustained effort of the entire project. Carl maintained an 8-inch channel running upward through the core of the pillar as it rose, checking its diameter with a cut length of iron pipe at every course to ensure it remained consistent. Smoke from the ring firebox would enter the base of this channel and rise through the pillar's interior, surrendering heat to the surrounding granite from the inside, while the ring firebox simultaneously charged the exterior. The stone would be heated from both directions, exterior flame and interior exhaust working in concert, driving energy into the mass from every available surface. By the time exhaust gases reached the roof, they would have given most of what they carried. The stack would run cool, The smoke would be thin. The energy that would have gone straight up a conventional chimney would instead be living in the granite. Carl coated the interior surface of the flue with a clay slip he had prepared separately, a thin wash to prevent smoke from penetrating the mortar joints and creating deposits that would eventually obstruct the draft. He applied it by hand, working in the confined dark of the rising pillar's core with a rag wrapped around a long stick. Marta held the lantern. The work advanced at 3 inches per day, not from inadequate effort, but from the nature of the craft. Stone fitted by hand could not be hurried without sacrificing the contact between courses that gave the structure its integrity. A gap in a mortar joint was not merely a cosmetic flaw. It was a thermal break, a point where heat would escape the mass rather than being retained in it. Every joint Carl laid, he pressed with his thumb and examined with his eye and checked again the following morning when the mortar had begun its cure. By the last week of July, the pillar stood complete, 3 feet across, 8 feet tall, with a ring firebox at its base and a central flue rising to the roof opening Carl had framed in the temporary structure surrounding the construction site. The pillar weighed 3,200 pounds. It occupied the exact center of what would become the cabin floor, with the settled authority of something that expected to outlast everyone who had built it. Carl spent an hour walking around it before he was satisfied, pressing his palms against various sections, checking joints at height with a mirror on a stick, testing the draft with a lit strip of paper held at the base. Everything held. Everything breathed correctly. Word had circulated through the neighboring homesteads while construction was still underway. The German family was building a stone column in the center of their cabin floor. Not a fireplace, not a structural pillar. A freestanding column that served no load-bearing function and occupied what any experienced builder in the county would have identified as the most valuable position in a single-room cabin, the center where a table belonged, where a family gathered, where children moved at a distance from the heat source rather than crowding against it for survival. William Hartley rode over on a Thursday in early August. He owned the ranch property to the east, 3 times the acreage of the Brenner claim, and he had spent 15 years in Teller County through winters that had killed livestock and pushed 2 families off adjacent homesteads. He was 50 years old, weathered in the way of men who had spent decades solving problems outdoors, and he carried the settled assurance of someone who had survived long enough to trust what experience had taught him about what worked and what did not in mountain country at 9,000 feet. He found Carl standing beside the completed pillar, studying it with the focused attention a craftsman pays to finished work, not pride, but the practiced examination of someone identifying what might fail before winter found it first. Hartley reined his horse at the edge of the cleared site and looked at the column of stone rising through the center of the cabin framework. His expression moved through several stages before settling somewhere between genuine bewilderment and the particular kind of certainty that forms when a man has already decided what he thinks. Carl's voice was even as the silence extended past comfortable. "You came to see if the rumors were wrong." Hartley adjusted his hat against the afternoon light. "Brenner and the fact that he had already learned the name registered people in Creek are saying you built a stone column in the center of your floor. I assumed that couldn't be right. Nobody puts a column in the center of a cabin. That's table space. Table, that's where a family lives. The most valuable space in any cabin is wherever the heat begins." Carl did not step toward the man on horseback. He let the structure stand in its own defense. Americans put stoves in corners and wonder why the far corners hold 20 degrees while the stove side roasts. That outcome is geometrically inevitable. I put the heat source at the center, and every wall receives equal radiation. Every corner sits at equal distance from the source. The temperature variation across the full cabin drops to within a degree or two. Hartley looked at the pillar the way a man looks at an argument he cannot immediately dismantle but does not intend to accept. It's a pile of rocks in the middle of your room. It's 3,000 pounds of granite at the center of my room. The ring firebox heats the entire circumference simultaneously. The flue through the core means the exhaust surrenders its heat from the inside while the fire charges the outside. 2 hours of burning, and the stone holds what it was given for 12 hours or more. Every corner of this cabin will read the same temperature. Iron stoves get hot and do the job. Carl's hand rested against the pillar's surface, not for effect, but because the stone was warm from the August sun and the contact was natural. Iron stoves get hot and forget everything in 90 minutes. A corner stove weighing 300 pounds forgets what fire gave it before the fire is fully cold. This mass weighs 10 times that, and it will hold warmth until dawn. The mass is the memory. There is no other principle here. More mass, longer memory. Hartley turned his horse a degree or two the body language of a conversation, concluding on his terms. When you're navigating around that column in the dark and still cold, because stone can't hold heat through a Colorado January, don't say nobody warned you that a solid corner stove beats a pile of rocks every time. He rode east without waiting for a response. Carl watched him until the horse and rider cleared the tree line, then looked at the pillar. The pillar did not require comment. It stood and waited, as stone does, for conditions to arrive that would let it answer for itself. Marta came around from behind the cabin framework where she had been working on the final pointing of the east wall logs. She had heard everything, and her expression showed none of the reaction that listening had produced. She dried her hands on her apron and looked in the direction Hartley had ridden. He understands iron. He assumes stone behaves the same way. Her voice held no contempt, the tone of someone identifying an error, not the person who held it. He's survived 15 winters here. That's not nothing. It means his method worked well enough to survive. It doesn't mean his method is as good as it could be. She was quiet for a moment. By January, he'll understand what 3,000 pounds remembers. The community opinion organized itself in the weeks that followed into the configuration Carl had anticipated. The practical objection, prime floor space surrendered to an inert column of stone, ran through the county's collective assessment like a structural beam, load-bearing and unmovable. At the general store in Creek, where information traveled faster than horses could carry it, the verdict had been delivered before summer fully ended. The German couple on the north slope had built a monument in the middle of their floor. The man had wasted the best square footage in his entire cabin on a pile of rocks. What made the verdict easy to sustain was that it required no risk to hold. The Brenner cabin was visible to anyone passing on the road, the pillar, standing in its timber framework, occupying the center, an obvious impediment to normal living arrangements. The stone said nothing. It waited with the patience specific to its nature for the conditions that would let it demonstrate what patient things demonstrate when circumstances finally cooperate. Eric Lindqvist arrived in mid-August. He was a Norwegian farmer, 45, settled 4 miles south of the Brenner property, and his approach to the construction was different from Hartley's in one significant way. He was genuinely interested rather than certain he already knew the answer. He arrived alone on a weekday morning and walked around the pillar 3 times, examining the ring firebox from different angles before saying anything. His first question was not about center placement or floor space. It was about the air intake geometry at the firebox base. He crouched and examined the spacing of the 4 intake gaps with the attention of someone who had built large stone fireplaces and understood what the dimensions implied about draft behavior. He asked about the firebox channel width, the relationship between the intake area and the flue diameter, how the draft performed at full temperature versus at the tail end of a fire. Carl answered each question with a thoroughness he reserved for people whose questions demonstrated that they had thought before arriving. Lindqvist stood and placed his palm flat against the upper section of the pillar. In Norway, I have seen large stone wall fireplaces, very thick, hold heat through many hours. A pause that was genuine, not rhetorical. But they heat one direction. The far wall still drops 30 degrees below the fireplace wall in serious cold. The center placement is the second principle. The mass is the first. Without sufficient weight, the stone cannot hold long enough to matter. But mass placed against a wall solves only half the problem. The heat lasts, but it does not reach equally. Carl traced a gesture encompassing the pillar's circumference. A source at the center distributes to every surface simultaneously. Equal distance from the origin to every wall. The geometry makes uniformity inevitable rather than something you have to fight for. Lindqvist nodded slowly, following the logic at his own pace. He did not offer endorsement or dismissal. He was a man who would be persuaded by evidence and knew the evidence would not arrive until January. He said goodbye to Marta on his way out and rode south with the steady pace of someone working through an unfamiliar proof. It was in the 3rd week of August, while Carl was finishing the cabin walls and Marta was chinking the log gaps with a packed mixture of moss and clay that the news reached them from the Henderson property 2 miles west. A ranch hand named Davis had collapsed in the blacksmith shed on a morning when the forge had been running since before dawn. He had been working within 6 feet of the fire source continuously, a corner heat concentration in its most literal form, all the energy at one point, all the radiation moving in one direction, the worker existing within the most intense zone without any ability to escape it. He died before they could carry him to the house. The forge corner had scorched the wooden workbench beside it. The far end of the shed 12 feet away had been cold to the touch all morning. Carl heard the news from a rider who stopped briefly at the property line. He said nothing until Marta came in from the east wall and found him sitting still on an overturned crate with his hands loose in his lap. She asked what had happened. He told her. She sat across from him and was quiet for a moment. The same property that makes it dangerous in summer makes it useful in winter. The stone holds what it's given without judgment. He looked toward the pillar visible through the open cabin doorway. In August, it holds the cold it absorbed through June and July. By December, it will hold whatever fire gives it. The forge concentrated heat at one point and gave no relief to the worker trapped there. My pillar distributes heat from one point to every corner equally and asks the resident to stand nowhere dangerous. He paused. It doesn't choose. It holds. What you give it and where you put it determines everything else. Neither of them spoke further about Davis. The principle had stated itself completely. The ring firebox took its first fire on the morning of August 15th. Carl built the initial blaze from dry pine split to consistent dimensions, loading the combustion channel with a methodical care that Marta recognized as the particular concentration he brought to things he needed to work correctly. The draft pulled immediately, smoke curled around the pillar's base, found the central flue and rose through the interior channel with a steady draw that confirmed the system's geometry was functioning as intended. No backflow, no hesitation. The stone began to breathe. Carl held the fire at moderate intensity for the first hour, not pushing toward maximum temperature, but sustaining an even burn that would introduce heat gradually to the full mass. He checked the mortar joints at the base as the temperature climbed, looking for any movement or cracking. There was none. The clay mortar had cured correctly through the summer weeks. The stone accepted the heat with the patience of something that had been expecting it. After 2 hours, he let the fire diminish to coals without adding more fuel. He and Marta ate supper at the table positioned along the east wall, not at the cabin center, but not pressed into a corner either. The room held warmth in the specific way of a space with a radiant source at its center, not the cycling blast and fall of a stove working against its own cooling, but an even surrounding quality that seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously. Not from a corner, from the room itself. At 10 o'clock, Carl pressed his palm against the lower section of the pillar. Still too warm for extended contact, the stone had taken 2 hours of fire and was holding it without the rapid bleeding that iron would have shown by this point in the evening. At midnight, he checked again. Warm to the touch, deep and consistent, not the intense surface heat of the charging phase, but something that had moved into the interior of the mass and was releasing from everywhere at once. At 3 in the morning, he pressed his palm against the pillar's center section and found warmth still present, gentler than at midnight, but real, working its way upward through the full height of the structure as the heat distributed itself toward equilibrium. At dawn, he found Marta already standing before the pillar in the gray morning light before the sun had cleared the eastern peaks. Her palm was flat against the upper granite, and she had been there long enough that the surrounding air had adjusted to her presence. When Carl came to stand beside her, she did not turn. Still warm. Her voice was quiet, not triumphant. 12 hours. He pressed his hand against the stone beside hers. The granite held a temperature well above the cabin air, not a forceful heat, but something persistent and deep, the residue of a 2-hour fire given back slowly through the full night to every corner of the room with equal generosity. Marta kept her hand on the stone for a long time. Outside, the August morning was warming toward what would be the last comfortable weeks before autumn descended and announced the coming terms. The brutal January that waited 4 months beyond the visible horizon had the patience of something much heavier than the stone beneath her hand. She had known since she was 12 years old that fire died. She had known what happened in far corners when it did. She had carried that knowledge through 2 decades and across an ocean and up a mountain to a piece of Colorado ground where her husband had built what his father had taught him. Standing in that cabin with her hand against granite that had been warm for 12 hours and was warm still, something in the architecture of that old knowledge shifted, not released, not gone, but answered met with something equal in weight and patient, in the same way cold was patient, except working in the other direction. Carl watched her and understood without needing it explained that the pillar was not the same object for her that it was for him. For him, it was the correct technical solution, the right mass, the right placement, the right geometry applied to a problem he had understood since he was a boy mixing mortar in a frozen yard. For Marta, it completed something that had been open for most of her life, a question posed in a far bedroom in Germany that had gone unanswered for 26 years. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the stone had not already said more plainly. 3,000 pounds remembers what 300 forgets. And in the far corners, in the places where the fire's light never reaches, and the corner stove's warmth grows thin before it arrives, the memory is not a comfort. It is the difference. In Creek that afternoon at the counter of the general store where the county's collective opinion went, to confirm itself, a rancher's wife was explaining to two other women that the German couple on the north slope had built some kind of monument in the middle of their floor. A pillar, she said, stone clear up to the ceiling. They have to walk around it to get anywhere. The Brenner man had wasted the best square footage in his entire cabin on a pile of rocks that wouldn't heat anything when January arrived. The women listening nodded with the conviction of people who had already decided. The pillar stood in the center of the cabin and was still warm at dawn, and none of the women in the store in Creek knew this, and it made no difference that they did not. What was true in the stone was true without witnesses. Outside the completed cabin on the ground where the pine stake had stood, since April, there was now only a small depression in the earth, the stake pulled and set aside the morning after the first fire test, its function absorbed by the thing it had marked. The pillar needed no marker. It was its own answer, standing at the center, waiting for January to arrive from the Wyoming line, with everything it intended to prove. 4 months remained. They would not be quiet months. September arrived in Teller County not as a transition, but as a declaration. The aspens on the north-facing slopes went yellow overnight, the way they do at altitude when the temperature drop crosses a threshold. The trees have been quietly monitoring since July. Carl watched the color spread down from the peaks and felt in it the specific pressure of a deadline, not threat exactly, but the mountain's way of stating terms. The pillar stood complete. The cabin walls were sealed and chinked. The woodpile that would feed the ring firebox through the season sat stacked under a lean-to roof against the south wall, cut and split to the dimensions the firebox channel required. Everything was ready for January. January was not yet ready for them, but the aspens were announcing that the gap was closing. The opinion in Creek had not softened in the weeks since the pillar's completion. If anything, it had organized itself into something with more structural integrity than the summer version, which had been relatively casual in its certainty. By September, the verdict had been repeated enough times to calcify. The German stonemason had wasted the best floor space in his cabin on a column of rock that served no function. A good corner stove could not provide better. And when the serious cold arrived, not the shoulder season frost of October, but the killing cold of January and February that came down off the Wyoming line, with intention, the German family would understand what every experienced homesteader in Teller County already knew about mountain winters. The confidence was not malicious. It was the certainty of people whose accumulated experience had produced methods that worked well enough to survive, who had no way of knowing that surviving and thriving were not the same answer, and who had no reference point for the tradition Carl was applying. They had never seen a cockalofen. The closest thing in their experience was a brick chimney which held some warmth but was always placed against a wall and never approached the mass required to make the principle fully operative. Their skepticism was rational given what they knew, and Carl understood this. He did not argue with it. He let the coming winter carry the argument. What he had not anticipated was the form that community skepticism would take when the first frost arrived and transformed the abstract debate about floor space and stone into something with immediate physical stakes. William Hartley appeared at the property line on the morning of October 4th, his breath already visible in the air, frost still on the ground in the shadow of the tree line. He had ridden over with a new concern, not the same floor space objections of August, but something he had apparently been developing across the weeks between visits, because he delivered it with the compact precision of a man who had rehearsed it to his satisfaction. "I've been thinking on your arrangement, Brenner." He remained on horseback as though committing to a dismount implied a level of engagement he had not decided to offer. Stone is cold by nature. Everyone who's lived in this territory knows it. Walk into a stone building in summer, and it's cool inside regardless of the heat outside. Your pillar is going to pull the warmth out of your cabin, not put it in. Carl set down the splitting maul he had been working with and looked at the man on the horse with the patience of someone who has already thought through the objection being raised. Stone feels cold in summer because it spent the winter absorbing cold temperatures, and the mass holds what it absorbed. The same capacity that makes it cool in August makes it warm in January after the fire charges it. The property doesn't choose which direction to work in. It works in whichever direction the temperature differential points. That's not how it feels when you touch it. Feeling and function are different measurements. In summer, the stone is releasing coolness into a warm room. In winter, it releases warmth into a cold room. The mechanism is identical. What changes is the direction of the transfer. Carl picked up the maul again. "Come back in January and press your palm against it 12 hours after the last fire dies. What you feel then will answer your concern better than anything I say now." Hartley adjusted his hat against the morning glare. "I'm telling you what 15 winters in this county have taught me. Stone doesn't hold heat. Iron does. Every rancher in Teller County heats with iron because iron works. Iron works for 90 minutes after the fire dies, minus. Then it forgets everything. 10 times the mass holds heat 10 times as long, and stone releases it slowly rather than all at once. Your corner stove roars and then goes cold. My pillar will still be warm when your stove has been dead for 9 hours." Hartley rode east without a formal conclusion to the exchange, which was his characteristic method of ending conversations he had not won. Carl watched him go, then looked at the sky, reading the pressure in the way his father had taught him to read it, not the surface color, but the quality of the light, the way clouds sat on the peaks, whether the wind carried moisture or carried only cold. What he saw did not reassure him. The week ahead would bring the first real frost. He went back to splitting wood with the focused attention of a man whose opinions would be tested by conditions shortly, and who found it more productive to be ready than to be right in advance. The crack appeared on October 9th. Carl found it during his morning inspection of the pillar, a habit he had maintained since the structure's completion, a 3-minute circuit of the full circumference, hands moving across joints and faces looking for any change from the previous day's condition. The crack was hairline located at a mortar joint, approximately 4 feet from the floor on the south-facing section of the pillar, running perhaps 8 inches along the joint line before disappearing into the surrounding stone face. It had not been there on October 8th. He was certain of this the way craftsmen are certain of things they examine with systematic regularity. He stood before it for a full minute without moving. His mind moved through the sequence of likely causes with the efficiency of someone diagnostically trained, and arrived at the conclusion quickly he had pushed the test fire too hard in late September, accelerating thermal cycling beyond what the mortar had been given time to accommodate. The clay and lime mixture had cured correctly through the summer, but curing at ambient temperature was different from the microstress of rapid repeated heating. The joints needed more gradual introduction to operational temperatures. He had been impatient to confirm what he already believed, and the stone had recorded his impatience in the one language available to it. The structural implication was worse than the crack's dimensions suggested. A single failed joint in a 3,200-pound freestanding pillar was not by itself catastrophic. But if the cause was thermal cycling stress applied to mortar that had been insufficiently seasoned for the role, then every joint in the structure was carrying similar vulnerability. The first January fire, a full 2-hour charge at maximum temperature, exactly the conditions the pillar needed to perform, could open 5 more cracks simultaneously. If the structure settled unevenly under repeated stress, the central flue channel could be compromised. A compromised flue meant smoke entering the cabin. It meant the draft failed. It meant everything Carl had built and everything Carl had staked against the community's certainty that he was wrong would fail in its first serious winter. Not slowly, not quietly, but visibly, comprehensively, and in precisely the cold season, when he had told every skeptic in the county to come back and see. He found himself sitting on the edge of the firebox ring at 2 in the morning, the lantern on the floor beside him, his right hand running along the crack in the specific repetitive way of someone measuring something they cannot stop measuring. The cabin was fully dark except for the lantern's reach, and the pillar rose above him in shadow, and the crack was perhaps 8 inches of evidence that patience had a limit and that he was not immune to the pressures it defined. Marta came from the bed in her coat without being called. She had always been a light sleeper, calibrated to disturbances in the architecture of a night, and a lantern moving in the cabin at 2 in the morning was a disturbance she had registered and moved toward before she was fully awake. She looked at the crack for a moment, her hand following the same path Carl's had traced. Then, how long to repair it properly? 2 weeks if the weather gives us temperature above freezing during the days. He did not soften the situation or enlarge it. I need to recut the joint pack with fresh mortar and let it cure under controlled conditions before we fire it again. And I need to inspect every joint on the circumference. If this one opened, others are under the same stress. Does Hartley know? No one knows. I found it this morning. She sat beside him on the firebox ring and looked at the pillar from the sitting angle, which gave it a different quality than the standing view, larger in proportion to their own bodies, more permanent, more demanding of the patience it embodied. Then we fix it before anyone needs to know. 2 weeks. Carl looked at his wife in the lantern light. There was no reassurance in what she had said, which was what made it function as reassurance. She was not telling him it would be fine. She was telling him the next step and the time required and the information that needed to be controlled, and all of that was the same thing as competence, which was the only form of confidence she had ever offered him and the only form he had learned to trust. They worked on the repair for 11 days. Outside, the first hard frost arrived on October 12th and sat on the ground through the mornings with the settled permanence of a season announcing its intentions. Inside, Carl and Marta worked against a deadline they could feel in the air, but could not yet answer the frost pressing at the walls while the pillar stood sealed and silent. No fire permitted in the ring channel until the new mortar reached its full cure. Carl recut 6 joints that his inspection identified as carrying stress fractures, too small to be visible to the eye but detectable by the fingertips' trained sensitivity. A slight give at the mortar surface, a faint sound when the knuckle tapped adjacent to the joint that differed from the dense return of intact stone. He packed each joint with fresh mortar, mixed at a lower clay ratio, that he had adjusted after research, a formula his father had used for high cycling units that Carl had carried in his memory for 20 years and never before needed to apply. Marta held the lantern for 3 of the evenings while he worked at the upper sections, her other hand steadying the wooden scaffold they had built to access the pillar's top third. On the 7th evening of the repair work, while Carl was packing a joint at ceiling height, and Marta sat below him, holding the light, she told him about Peter. She spoke without introduction, as though the conversation had been running in her head for some time, and she was joining it at a point already in progress. Her voice did not change character as she told it, not flatter or more careful, but steady, in the way that things are steady when they have been carried long enough that their weight has been fully incorporated into how a person moves through the world. She described the farmhouse bedroom. She described the secondary stove. She described the morning and what she had found. She described what she had understood at 12 years old, standing in a doorway in Germany, that she had never articulated to another person because it had not required articulation. It had simply required application. Carl climbed down from the scaffold and sat beside her on the floor of the cabin, with his back against the pillar. He did not speak immediately. He held what she had told him in the quiet, the way you hold something that changes the shape of everything it touches. After a long time, he spoke into the darkness above the lantern's reach. You never needed me to argue the case. I knew what happened when fire had no memory. I knew what a far corner meant at 3 in the morning. A pause, wrong. I needed you to build it correctly. That was always the different thing you brought. Carl looked at the crack repair of the section he had just packed, the mortar still damp in the joint at needing its remaining days. He thought about the adjustment he had made to the air intake geometry 2 days earlier. After a separate analysis of the thermal cycling stress, he had widened the lower intake gaps by 1/4 inch to allow more even combustion distribution at the firebox base, reducing the temperature differential between the south face of the pillar, which had always charged slightly hotter due to its proximity to the primary air supply, and the north face. The change was small enough that no one visiting the structure would notice it. It reduced peak surface temperature by an estimated 12 degrees at the hot face while raising the cold face by a comparable amount. More uniform charging meant more uniform storage, meant more uniform release. He had made the adjustment because the physics required it. But he made it that particular week with that particular precision because Marta had told him about Peter and the distance between a far corner at 3 in the morning and a fire that had gone cold was a distance he wanted to make smaller by every increment available to him. The mortar cured, the joints held, the repair completed on October 20th, confirmed through a careful inspection that satisfied every standard Carl applied to his own work. They told no one. The pillar stood complete and sound as October crisis resolved in the same quiet collaboration with which it had been built, two people working at the edge of their knowledge until the structure held what it was meant to hold. 3 days later, with the repair mortar fully cured and the temperatures dropping reliably below zero after dark, Carl built the first proper operational fire of the season. He loaded the ring channel with the care and timing he had been refining across the August and September test pine kindling to establish the draft, then dense hardwood splits enough fuel to carry 2 hours of sustained combustion at medium intensity. He banked the coals at 10 o'clock and stepped back. At midnight, he placed his palm against the south face and felt heat radiating at an intensity he could hold against for 4 seconds before the surface temperature pushed his hand back. The interior would be hotter still, heat moving inward through the mass toward equilibrium, distributing itself through 3,000 pounds of granite with the unhurried intention of something that had nowhere else to be. Marta stood at the northwest corner of the cabin with the thermometer they had mounted there specifically because it represented the point geometrically furthest from the pillar in any direction. Her voice came across the dark room without drama, reading what she read 61 degrees Fahrenheit in the far corner. Carl moved to the northeast corner, 61, southwest 62. The variation from the thermal source's closest point to the room's most distant point was less than 2 degrees. Outside, the air temperature had settled to 2 degrees below zero. Inside, in every corner, equally 61 degrees of warmth was present because 3,000 pounds of granite stood at the center, charged in remembering sharing what the fire had given it with the mathematical equity of a source placed at the origin point of a distribution problem. He stood in the cabin at midnight and thought about the Henderson Ranch 2 miles west, where a corner stove was running continuously to hold the near zone against the cold, and the far zone was below 40 degrees regardless of what the stove produced. He thought about every family in Teller County feeding fires in the dark and waking cold in the far corners of their own homes. He thought about Samuel Thorne, the bachelor homesteader 3 miles north, who had spoken to Carl briefly at the supply store in September and declined the invitation to come see the pillar. Thorne had a small iron stove in the northeast corner of his one-room claim cabin. He burned through his wood pile fast and supplemented with coal when the price permitted. The far corner of his cabin, as Carl had estimated from the outside dimensions and corner placement, sat roughly 20 feet from the heat source. At 10 below zero, that 20 feet was not a distance. It was a sentence. George Aldrich arrived in the second week of November with a surveyor's transit on his wagon and a leather notebook already half full of figures from other properties in the county. He was a civil engineer contracted by a Denver development firm to assess homestead construction quality across 3 mountain counties as part of a land valuation project. Practical work with no connection to the Brenner property's particular interest, until he stopped at the general store in Creek and heard 3 people in the same conversation mention the German stonemason's stone pillar. He arrived without appointment on a Thursday morning, introduced himself with the efficiency of a man who assessed a great many properties in a short time and had developed a method for it. His interest was immediately technical. He walked around the pillar in the same way Lindqvist had done in August, but his circuit included taking dimensions, measuring the firebox channel with a folding rule, examining the flue opening at the base with a small mirror, and asking questions whose precision revealed both genuine knowledge and genuine curiosity. He knew what specific heat capacity meant. He understood the BTU math without needing it explained. When Carl described the charging and discharge cycle, Aldrich was ahead of him by a sentence confirming the logic as it arrived rather than absorbing it as new information. You've applied a principle that German building tradition established 5 centuries ago to a specific American problem in a way nobody on this continent has formalized. He made a note in his leather book, then looked up. May I document the design specifications, fully dimensions, firebox geometry, flue channel, sizing, mass calculation. I'm thinking about a technical paper for the Colorado Engineering Society. Your design deserves a formal write-up. Carl felt something in this that he could not immediately name, not suspicion exactly, but the awareness of a gap between what was being offered and what was being requested. He was not a man practiced in the contractual implications of intellectual exchange. He said yes because a technical paper seemed harmless and the man's interest seemed genuine. Aldrich spent 3 hours with his tools and his notebook, measured everything, drew diagrams in the margins, and left in the early afternoon with the compressed courtesy of someone who had what he came for. 2 weeks later, Marta came home from the Creek supply store with a stillness in her face that Carl recognized as the specific stillness of someone who has received information they are still arranging into an appropriate response. She had been at the counter waiting for a bolt of winter flannel when she overheard 2 men from the county surveying office discussing a patent application that had been filed with the territorial office in Denver the previous week. A design patent for a central thermal mass heating system, a cylindrical stone pillar positioned at the geometric center of a single-room dwelling, incorporating a circumferential combustion channel at the base and a central exhaust flue. The applicant's name on the filing was George Aldrich of Denver, Colorado. Carl sat down at the table and was quiet for long enough that Marta brought him water without being asked, which was not something she did in ordinary circumstances. His name was not on the filing. The design his father had taught him, that his father's father had applied in the Black Forest a generation before, that 5 centuries of German craftsmen had developed into a tradition with its own master practitioners and apprentice lineages, was being filed as the property of a civil engineer who had spent 3 hours in Carl's cabin with a folding rule. He wrote the letter over 3 evenings in German first, and then working through the English translation with the help of the county circuit pastor who had grown up in Pennsylvania Dutch country and had enough German to catch the places where Carl's idiom failed him. The letter was addressed not to the territorial patent office. He had been told clearly that prior art objections required legal representation he could not afford, but to the Colorado Engineering Society's journal in Denver, the same publication Aldrich had mentioned. The letter described the Kakalofan tradition by name and by century. It named Carl's father and described the lineage of practice that had produced the knowledge Aldrich was claiming. It included the address of the Teller County property and a standing invitation to any engineer or member of the journal's editorial board to visit during January and observe what the design produced under operational conditions. The letter's final line, which the pastor translated 3 times before Carl, was satisfied with the English. If Mr. Aldrich's name belongs on this design, it belongs there alongside Heinrich Brenner of Baden and Johann Brenner before him, and the unnamed master builders of 5 generations before that who made this knowledge from winter itself. The letter was not published. The journal returned it without comment, which was its standard practice with correspondence from non-members and non-engineers. Aldrich's patent application was denied 3 months later, not because of Carl's letter which had not reached the right office, but because the territorial examiner found sufficient prior art in documented German Kakalofan construction to reject the claim of originality. Aldrich wrote Carl a brief note in January acknowledging the denial, which arrived without apology or explanation, only the fact of the outcome. Carl read the note once and set it on the table and did not discuss it with Marta because there was nothing to discuss that the outcome had not already resolved. He had not won anything. He had not needed to. The principle remained his in the way that things remain the property of the people who understand them fully regardless of what documents say, and the January that was approaching would do more for his position in this argument than any filing with any office in Denver could have accomplished. December settled onto Teller County with the gradual weight of something that intended to stay. The daily temperature dropped in increments that seemed negotiable until the last week of the month, when the negotiation ended, and the cold simply announced itself as permanent for the foreseeable future. Carl and Marta had established their operational rhythm through November, an evening fire in the ring channel for 2 hours, consistent, hardwood, consistent timing, banking the coals at a fixed hour, and letting the stone complete its work through the night without assistance. They woke to uniform warmth every morning. They slept without interruption. The woodpile descended at a rate that Carl calculated every Sunday, and the calculation consistently showed consumption running at approximately one-tenth of what the neighboring homesteads were burning. He knew this because Hartley had mentioned his wood consumption in passing at the supply store in November, a cord every 4 days under current conditions with January still ahead. Carl was consuming a cord every 40 days. The differential was not an estimate. It was a measurement confirmed against the shrinkage of his own woodpile and the numbers Hartley had offered without realizing their comparative significance. Samuel Thorne came into the supply store on the morning of December 14th, loading a wagon with coal and dry goods. He was a bachelor of about 50, rangy and self-contained, the kind of man who had built his life around needing no one's assistance and had succeeded at this long enough that the quality had become structural. He loaded his wagon with the focused economy of someone for whom every trip to town represented a specific calculation of cost and time and need. Carl was at the counter settling his account when Thorne came in, and they stood 3 feet apart for the length of time it took for their respective transactions to complete. Carl looked at the coal Thorne was loading and at the man's hands, which showed the particular dryness of skin that came from repeated exposure to fire-adjacent heat, the hands of someone who spent time close to a stove. He thought about the cabin he had seen from the road, a one-room structure, northeast corner, stove single window on the south wall. He thought about the geometry. He thought about January. "You're welcome to come see the pillar before the hard season arrives," Carl said. "Not urgency, a plain offer. I can show you the construction if you want to understand the principle before deciding anything about it." Thorne looked at him with the direct appraisal of a man who processed other people's intentions quickly and distrusted elaborate ones. "I have a good stove and enough coal for January. I've done my winters without a stone monument in my floor." He finished loading his coal and tied the wagon cover. "I'll manage." He drove north out of town without looking back. Carl stood on the store's porch and watched the wagon clear the main road, and Marta came out behind him and stood at his right shoulder looking in the same direction. She said nothing for a long time. Then quietly and without inflection, "He didn't ask what it cost." Carl understood that she was not talking about money. A man who had done his winters alone, who had built his self-sufficiency into something he trusted more than any neighbor's advice, would not ask the cost of changing his method, because he had already made the calculation that mattered to him, the cost of needing to be told what to do by someone else. That cost was higher than cold. It was higher than coal. It was possibly higher than any temperature Teller County could produce, which was not a thing Carl judged. He recognized it because he had felt something adjacent to it himself, standing in a foreign country with 30 years of knowledge no one around him wanted to hear. He went home and split wood until dark. The last week of December brought the air that the old-timers in Creek identified by a quality they could not precisely describe but did not mistake for anything else. A dryness that had temperature inside it, a stillness that preceded movement on a large scale, a way that the peaks held their cloud cover, that suggested the clouds were weight-bearing. The rancher at the saloon, who had been in the county since before the Colorado Railroad reached its present end, described it as smelling like 1872, and the men who had been here in 1872 went quiet in a way that served as confirmation. On the evening of January 5th, Carl built the evening fire with different attention than usual. He loaded the ring channel to its full capacity, not the moderate charge of the November and December routine, but a full 2-hour burn with hardwood split to the dimensions that maximize combustion, surface area, driving the pillar toward its highest sustainable temperature before banking for the night. He stacked additional wood inside the cabin door within reach of the ring channel, an emergency reserve he had not needed through the fall. He did not explain this to Marta because Marta was doing the same calculation he was doing, reading the same sky, feeling the same pressure in the air that preceded serious weather. After the fire was banked and the coals settled to their orange geometry, in the ring channel he sat at the table and looked at the pillar. The surface read somewhere above 200 degrees at the lower section. He could tell by the behavior of a small cup of water he held close. The steam pulled away from the stone's face in the manner of a surface above that threshold. 3,000 pounds charged to maximum capacity and sitting at the center of a room that was currently 58 degrees in every corner. Marta was at the small writing desk against the east wall, working on something by lantern light. He had noticed her returning to it over several evenings in December, without asking about its nature, respecting the particular privacy of someone in the middle of a thought they were not yet finished with. She set down the pen and held the pages for a moment in the light, reading back what she had written. Then she opened the family Bible that sat on the shelf above the desk her grandmother's brought from Germany, its leather cover worn soft, and placed the folded pages inside it between the front matter and the first chapter. Done, she said, not to Carl, but to the room, or to the Bible, or to the air. Then she turned to her husband. Ready. Carl did not ask what she had written. He understood that it was addressed to people who did not yet exist, the children and grandchildren of this cabin, the people who would inherit the warmth they were building on this night without knowing yet that the inheritance was real. Outside, the wind that had been still all evening began to move. It came from the north-northwest with a sound in the pines that was different from the routine winter wind, lower in frequency, more deliberate, as though it was carrying something behind it and clearing the way. The temperature on the outside thermometer mounted to the south wall cabin log dropped 3 degrees in the 20 minutes between when Carl checked it at 9 o'clock and when he checked it at 9:20. He banked the cabin door with the second draft seal they had made in November, a long sausage of wool stuffed with shredded bark that pressed against the threshold gap and stopped the low-level infiltration that even a well-built cabin produced at extreme temperatures. He checked the window seal and the gap around the stovepipe flashing. The pillar stood in the center of the room and held its heat with the patience of 3,000 pounds that had never been asked to hurry and had no reason to start. At the center of every cabin in Teller County, if you measured the floor plan and walked to its mathematical middle, there was air, empty space, the most thermally useless material available. Cold as whatever surrounded it, incapable of memory. In this cabin, there was granite. The difference was already outside, gathering itself in the dark. The storm came down from Wyoming on the night of January 7th without the preliminary wind that usually announced serious weather. It arrived instead as a silence, the particular absence of sound that extreme cold produces when it displaces the ordinary air of a place and installs itself as the new permanent condition. The temperature had been 14 degrees below zero at sundown. By midnight, it was 31 below. By the morning of January 8th, it had dropped to 43 below zero and was still falling, and the wind that arrived with the dawn was not the variable directional wind of ordinary winter, but a continuous pressure from the north-northwest that found every structure in Teller County and tested it the way a hand tests a seam, not looking for the weak point, already knowing it was there, simply waiting for the right moment to confirm it. Carl rose before first light on January 8th and checked the outside thermometer by lantern. The mercury had retreated to the bottom of its range. He checked the pillar, pressing his palm against its south face, still radiating the heat deep in the stone and releasing steadily in every direction. He had banked the previous evening's fire at 8 o'clock 12 hours earlier. The cabin held 56 degrees in every corner. Outside the sealed door, the air temperature was incompatible with extended human presence without shelter. The distance between those two numbers was the entire argument. He added fuel to the ring channel, not a full 2-hour fire, but a maintenance charge, 40 minutes of moderate burning to top off what the 12 hours of discharge had given back to the room. The pillar was not empty. It was running at perhaps 60% of its maximum charge, releasing heat at a rate the cabin could absorb without working against itself. A full recharge now would bring it back to capacity before the worst of the day arrived. He banked the coals at 7 and returned to the table in the morning routine, and the storm pressed against every surface of the cabin with the particular determination of something that knew it had time. 3 miles north, Samuel Thorne was already feeding his corner stove at full capacity. He had been at it since 4 in the morning when the cold woke him in the specific way. Extreme cold wakes people who are sleeping in compromised environments, not from the surface, which blankets can defend against, but from the floor and the far walls, which conduct cold inward without asking permission. He had stacked the stove to its maximum and sat in the near zone within 4 feet of its glowing iron face, and the heat had been aggressive and immediate and real, and 20 feet away in the opposite corner, the temperature was below what water needed to remain liquid. Thorne was not a man who admitted to difficulty. He had built his claim on self-sufficiency as a structural principle, and that principle had served him through 3 Colorado winters at 9,000 feet without asking anything of his neighbors that he could not provide for himself. He had enough coal. He had dry wood for kindling. He had a stove that worked the way stoves worked, hot, near the source, negligible at distance, and he had learned to live within the thermal radius of that source, the way a man learns to live within any limitation, by not moving past its edge. He slept near the stove. He worked near the stove. He ate near the stove. The far corner of his one-room cabin was a zone he had implicitly ceded to the cold as part of the arrangement. What January 1890 brought was a cold that declined to honor the boundary of that arrangement. By January 10th, the temperature outside had been below -30 for 72 continuous hours. The stove's near zone, which had held reliably at 60 degrees through December, was struggling to maintain 45 against the cold that came through the east and north walls with a patience that the stove's iron could not match. Thorne moved his chair closer to the stove. He added fuel at shorter intervals. He burned through coal at a rate he had not budgeted for because the winter he had budgeted for was not the winter that had arrived. On the night of January 10th, in the specific hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, when fire and its servants are both at their lowest, the coal bin ran to its last supply. Thorne had cut his consumption estimates correctly for an ordinary January. He had not cut them for a January that dropped 40 degrees below historical averages and held there without compromise for 5 days. The stove burned through the remaining coal in the early morning hours of the 11th, and by 6 in the morning it was warm to the touch, but no longer hot, and by 8 it was room temperature, which was no longer a phrase with its ordinary meaning. The wind found the door gap and the window frame and the unchinked section of the north log wall that Thorne had intended to repair before winter and had postponed. It entered without urgency the way cold enters structures that have stopped defending themselves gradually, at first, then completely. The temperature in the near zone dropped to the temperature in the far zone dropped to the temperature of the air outside, and the distinction between inside and outside became a matter of roof angle rather than warmth. They found Samuel Thorne on the morning of January 14th, when the storm had briefly eased enough for a rider from the Henderson property to attempt the road. He was in the far corner of his cabin, the point geometrically furthest from the northeast stove. The stove had been cold for 30 hours. The floorboards adjacent to the stove showed a scorch mark from the period when it had been running at maximum capacity, the iron reaching temperatures its location concentrated onto a single surface area. The corner where Thorne lay was frosted on the interior wall above his body. The coal bin was empty, and the kindling pile beside it was untouched, the wood he would have used to restart a fire if restarting had remained a possibility. He had died of cold at a distance of 20 feet from a heat source that no longer existed. The heat source that had existed had never been designed to bridge 20 feet of open room at 40 below zero. The geometry had been working against him from the day he drove the first nail. He had simply not known this in any way that changed his behavior. And the winter of 1890 was not a winter that allowed unknowing to remain comfortable. When the news reached the Brenner property by Ryder on the afternoon of January 14th, Carl was splitting the day's supplemental wood inside the cabin door. He set the splitting maul down against the wall and stood still for a moment with the particular stillness of someone receiving information that confirmed something they hoped would not be confirmed. Marta was at the east wall bench, and she looked up when Carl's posture changed, and she did not ask what had happened because the stillness had told her it was not a question she needed to ask aloud. He told her in a flat voice. She put down what she was holding. Neither of them spoke for a while, and the pillar stood between them, radiating steadily in every direction, indifferent to human interpretation, doing what mass does, releasing what it had been given, with the unhurried equity of physics. Carl's voice, when it came, was quiet enough that Marta had to hold still to hear it. He would still be alive if the stove had been at the center. This was not a statement of guilt which Carl did not carry. He had offered, Thorne had declined. The decision had been Thorne's to make. It was something closer to an accounting, the stonemason's habit of measuring the precise difference between what was built and what could have been built, and identifying exactly where the gap produced its consequences. The pillar was not a triumph in that moment. It was a measure of what had been possible and what had not been chosen, and both were real, and only one of them was still standing. The storm broke briefly on January 15th, temperatures rising from the killing depths to a merely severe range that allowed movement if a man was dressed appropriately and willing to accept the cost. William Hartley was willing. He had been planning the ride for 2 days, waiting for a window the storm would allow, And when the wind dropped below 20 miles per hour at mid-morning, he saddled his horse and rode the 3 miles to the Brenner property through cold that treated every exposed inch of skin as an opportunity. He arrived looking like a man who had made a deliberate decision to suffer in service of understanding something. His face was raw beneath the scarves he had layered across everything below his eyes. His hands inside 3 pairs of stacked gloves had lost sensation in the fingertips somewhere on the second mile. He did not immediately dismount when he reached the property. He sat his horse in the yard and looked at the cabin's chimney for a long moment. A thin wisp of vapor barely visible, the evidence of a structure not fighting its environment so much as existing comfortably within it. His own chimney at the ranch house had been pouring thick columns of smoke continuously for 8 days. The differential was visible from horseback and required no measurement. Marta opened the door before he reached it, which meant she had seen him coming through the small south window and had decided without consulting Carl that the door would open when he arrived rather than after he knocked. This was the kind of decision she made silently that shaped the terms of situations before they fully formed. Hartley came through the door and Carl closed it behind him, and what happened to the man in the first seconds inside that room was visible in the change his body made a release of the particular contracted posture that people assume against extreme cold, the shoulders dropping, the hands unclenching inside their gloves, the face beginning the slow process of returning sensation to surfaces that had been defending themselves for 2 hours. Not from a blast of heat from a corner, from an even surrounding warmth that came from everywhere simultaneously and asked him to stand nowhere specific to receive it. He walked to the far corner without speaking. He pressed his palm against the north wall, then the east wall. Then he crossed to the south wall and pressed it there. He was checking all of them the way a man checks the evidence of something he was told but needs to feel with his own hands before the information becomes real. Carl watched him without speaking. There was nothing to say that the room had not already said to the man's hands. Hartley stood at the far corner, the point diagonally furthest from the pillar in every direction, the position in this cabin equivalent to the position where Samuel Thorne had been found 2 days earlier, and the wall behind him was 56 degrees and his palm against it felt warmth rather than the cold that had killed a man on this same night in a cabin built differently. He turned and looked at the pillar. Carl's voice came quiet and without performance. Last fire was yesterday evening, 6 o'clock, 18 hours ago. Hartley crossed to the pillar and placed both gloved hands against its surface and then pulled the outer gloves off to feel the stone directly. The warmth that moved into his cold fingers was deep and consistent, the kind of heat that lives inside a mass rather than on its surface, not the aggressive radiation of a stove at full burn, but something more patient, more permanent, more willing to give what it held without demanding that you stand close enough to scorch. His voice when it came was different from any register he had used in the previous conversations, stripped of the practiced authority he had carried as a 15-year resident of the county, telling a newcomer what worked and what did not. I said stone can't hold heat through the night. You said what iron teaches every man who has only worked with iron. Carl's tone held no claim, only the fact. Iron teaches that heat is temporary. Stone teaches that heat can be stored. They are different lessons from different materials. Hartley pressed his hands flat against the granite for a long time. The warmth kept coming, even measured patient. How much wood did you burn yesterday? 8 pieces. The evening fire, 2 hours. The silence that followed had weight in it. Hartley had burned through more than half a cord in the same 24 hours, feeding 2 stoves around the clock. And his far corners had held 11 degrees while his near zone roasted, and his family huddled in the hot zone. And his son had spent 8 nights sleeping in the condensed warmth of the corner stove's proximity because the bed at the room's far end had become clinically dangerous. His son was the reason he had ridden through 40 below cold when any sensible man would have stayed inside. The boy was 12 years old and had developed the deep chest cough that the doctor in Creek had identified without hesitation as the beginning of pneumonia, the consequence of 8 nights of interrupted sleep in a cabin that swung between extremes. Too hot near the source, too cold at the margins, the body never reaching the sustained warmth that allowed proper rest and immune response. The doctor had said what needed to change. Hartley had known before the doctor finished speaking. He didn't tell Carl about the boy immediately. He stood at the pillar with his hands against the warm stone and let the information of the room do what information does when it is delivered by physics rather than by argument. It became permanent. not a position to consider, a fact to build on. I can't move a 3,000-pound pillar into my existing cabin. His voice was the voice of a man calculating rather than conceding. What I can do is rebuild come spring. Show me the ring firebox dimensions. Show me the foundation depth. I need to know what granite costs at that quarry 12 miles east. Carl went to the shelf for the rough sketches he had drawn in November, not for his own reference since he knew every dimension from memory, but because he had anticipated this conversation. He had drawn them out clearly with notations on 3 sheets of paper that he had folded together and placed where they would be easy to hand to a man sitting at his table. He spread them on the table surface, and Hartley sat down across from him and leaned forward, and the education that Carl had been conducting for 7 months, first by argument, then by demonstration, ultimately by the winter itself, passed into its final stage. They sat at the table for an hour. Carl answered every question with the precision of someone who understood that the man asking had a sick child and a wife who had not slept properly in more than a week and a woodpile that was failing against mathematics it had never been designed to overcome. He answered without satisfaction in being right, because being right had never been the point. The point was that a family somewhere in this county would approach next January with a different structure and therefore a different outcome. And that outcome was worth every hour Carl had spent arguing with people who did not yet understand what they were arguing against. Hartley rode home in the afternoon through cold that had not relented, carrying 3 sheets of folded paper inside his coat against his chest, where body heat would keep them from becoming brittle. He did not thank Carl before he left, which was characteristic. He was not a man who led with gratitude when action was still ahead of him. What he said at the door was, "Come spring, I want you to look at my site before I start the foundation. Tell me if I'm reading the ground correctly." Carl said he would come. The visitors arrived across the final 2 weeks of January in the pattern that information follows when it travels by word of mouth through a community that has just survived a collective emergency. Not all at once and not in order of need, but in the sequence determined by proximity to someone who had already been, which was itself determined by who had been desperate enough to ride 3 miles through the remnants of a killing cold snap to see a German stonemason's stone column for themselves. Eric Lindqvist came on January 20th. He arrived with the deliberate self-possession of a man who had thought carefully about what he was walking toward and had pre-decided not to be more impressed than the evidence justified. He spent an hour in the cabin walking its perimeter with the focused attention he had given the firebox in August, but this time he was checking wall temperatures with his palm rather than studying construction geometry. He moved from surface to surface without speaking, and his expression ran through several stages of internal recalibration before settling somewhere that was less Norwegian stubbornness and more Norwegian practicality. His hand rested against the pillar's north face for a long time. "Then my wall fireplace heats one direction strongly and every other direction weakly. I knew this. I accepted it because every building I had seen built the same way. I assumed the weakness was the condition rather than the choice." He looked at the distribution of warmth across the room with the eyes of someone who had just understood that what he thought was a constraint was actually a mistake someone had made 500 years ago and kept repeating. "Center placement makes sense that wall placement never did. I accepted the wrong geometry because I inherited it." Carl's answer was quiet and direct. "Most errors survive because they work well enough that no one is forced to find better. This winter forced it." George Aldrich arrived on January 23rd. He came alone and without his transit and without his leather notebook, which was the clearest signal available that this visit was different in nature from November's. He did not ask to measure anything. He stood inside the cabin door for a moment, looking at the pillar with an expression that held something more complicated than professional assessment, and then he walked to the far corner and stood there in the uniform warmth with his hands at his sides. He did not mention the patent. Carl did not mention the patent. The outcome had already resolved itself through proper channels, and what remained was not a dispute but simply 2 men in a warm room, one of whom had built the room, and one of whom had learned something in it. Aldrich sat at the table and accepted the coffee Marta set in front of him, and after a time he said, "I told myself I was documenting what you'd built so it could reach a wider audience. That was true enough that I let it be the whole truth." He looked at the table surface rather than at Carl. "It wasn't the whole truth. Carl did not offer absolution, which Aldrich had not asked for and which would not have served either of them. What Carl said was, the principle reaches who it reaches. My father taught it to me. I built it into this floor. Hartley is building it into his floor come spring. The knowledge moves the way useful knowledge moves, by demonstration, not by document. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried something that was not forgiveness, because no forgiveness was required but was close to its neighbor. You showed up in November because you recognized something real. That part was honest. Aldrich left in the early afternoon. The interaction had produced no neat resolution, no handshake over restored dignity, no formal acknowledgement that would have made a better story. It produced instead the small, permanent understanding between two men about the difference between what they owed each other and what had actually happened, which is a different and more durable thing than reconciliation. 13 people came through the Brenner cabin across the final 2 weeks of January. Each arrived with a variant of skepticism shaped by their specific experience and left with something different that depended on what they had been willing to feel and measure. A young rancher brought his wife. She stood at the far wall for 3 minutes in silence before saying anything, and what she said was addressed to her husband rather than to Carl. We are building this. A man from the eastern county line who had lost livestock to cold that crept into his barn through corner drafts asked questions about adaptation of the principle to larger structures. Carl drew diagrams for him on the back of a freight invoice. A surveyor named Breck brought proper instruments and documented what Aldrich had documented in November, but this time with Carl beside him explaining each measurement as it was taken, and Breck noting the attribution explicitly in his record book under the heading Central Thermal Mass System, Brenner Homestead, Teller County, constructed by Carl Brenner Stonemason, applying principles of the German Kakelofen tradition. It would appear in a county property survey filed in April 1890, which was not a publication and reached no engineering audience, but it was a document, and the document said what was true, and the document existed. February arrived, and the worst of the cold began its slow retreat toward the Wyoming line. The temperature came back up in increments, -20, then -10, then 0, then single digits above, like a tide that had reached its maximum and was now acknowledging the season's other half. The families that had survived, huddled in the hot corners of corner-heated cabins, came out of their defensive arrangements and found themselves blinking at the slightly more habitable air, with the particular relief of people who have passed through something they had not fully believed they would pass through. The wood piles told the story with the impartiality of physical evidence. Hartley had burned through 7 cords between January 1st and February 15th. Carl had burned through less than 1. The ratio was not a claim. It was a measurement available to anyone who cared to look at 2 adjacent wood piles and count the remaining ranks. In spring, when the ground thawed enough for foundation work, Carl drove to Hartley's ranch on the second Saturday of April. Hartley had already cleared the site and pulled the stakes for a new cabin footprint larger than the original structure, 24 feet square, with the center point already marked by a pine stake driven into the earth. He had read the sketches Carl had given him through the winter months until the notations were worn soft at the fold lines. The two men walked the site together in the April morning, Carl examining the subsoil at the staked center point by pushing a long iron rod into the earth and reading the resistance at different depths. The soil was good dense clay sublayer at 30 inches that would carry the foundation load without settling. He told Hartley to dig to 36 inches for additional margin on the east side where the grade ran slightly toward moisture. Hartley crouched at the stake and looked at the ground that would hold the base of the thermal column his family would live around for however many years the structure stood. He was a man who did not arrive at vulnerability easily or stay there long, and what he said had the character of something prepared and then stripped to its minimum. My boy's breathing right again. The doctor says he's clear. Carl looked at the stake in the center of the cleared ground and said nothing for a moment. Then, the pillar doesn't save anyone by itself, it saves the corner. Hartley understood that this was not a small distinction. The Hartley pillar was completed by late June, 1892, feet in diameter. Rather than 3 1,800 rather than 3,200, sourced from field granite that was less dense than Carl's quarry stone, but sufficient for the purpose. It would hold heat for 8 to 10 hours under full charge rather than 14 to 18. It would not achieve the temperature uniformity Carl's structure produced under maximum conditions. but it would reduce the cabin's temperature differential from 40 degrees to under 8. And it would do this on a third of the wood the corner stoves had required, and on the coldest night of the following January, Hartley's children would sleep in any corner of that cabin without danger. And the far corner would be warm, and the warmth would not be asking to be earned. By 19047, homesteads in Teller County had incorporated central thermal mass in some variation. A rancher named Kimball built a square masonry core instead of a cylinder, which produced slight directional bias at the flat faces but still outperformed any corner arrangement by a factor that made the comparison seem unfair in retrospect. A family named Ostrowski used dense brick where granite was unavailable and achieved 6 hours of post-fire radiation rather than 12, which was half the performance, but still 4 times better than the iron stove it replaced. Each adaptation was a translation of the same principle into available materials and specific circumstances. The principle surviving the translation because the principle was physical rather than stylistic. The winter of 1890 remained the county's benchmark for decades, the cold snap against which all subsequent cold was measured, the standard by which old-timers assessed a winter's seriousness. In every Teller County cabin that had faced that January with a corner stove, the geometry had worked against the people and it with the inevitability of physics applied without mercy. Hot spots and cold spots had divided those rooms into zones of survival and zones of suffering, and no amount of wood or effort had bridged the distance between them. The flaw was not in the fuel or the family's willingness to work. The flaw was in the placement of the origin point, a mistake inherited without examination accepted as condition rather than recognized as choice. In one cabin at 9,000 feet, a different choice had been made. 3,000 pounds of patient granite stood equidistant from every wall and released what it had been given to every corner equally, and in the morning the stone was warm, and no corner was a place where cold could settle and wait for the fuel to run out. The pillar asked nothing of the people who lived beside it. It required no midnight attention, no anxious monitoring, no negotiation about which part of the room was safe. It required only that you understand where to place the fire and how much stone to give it, and after that it did. What mass has always done, it remembered. It held it shared without preference with the deep patient equity of something that had been given warmth and had no reason to keep it for itself. Carl lived another 23 years on the Teller County property. He built no other structures as significant as the pillar, but he advised on 7 and helped lay the foundations of 3. He died in autumn 1913 at 66 years old in the cabin where the pillar stood at the center of the room, and the morning of his death, the stone was warm from the previous evening's fire the way it had been warm every morning of every winter for 23 years. Marta pressed her palm against it before the neighbors arrived because it was the morning ritual she had maintained since the first August test, and because that morning it meant something more specific than usual about the things that persisted and the things that did not. Marta outlived Carl by 6 years and died in the spring of 1919 in the same cabin. She pressed her palm against the pillar on the last morning she was able to rise from the bed. The stone was warm. It had been warm every morning since August of 1889. Whatever the weather had brought in from Wyoming had found the structure and found it unmoved, and in the morning the stone remembered, and in every corner the room was the same. After Marta passed, her daughter gathered the family Bible from the shelf above the east wall desk and found the folded pages placed there in the first week of January 1890. She read what her mother had written and then folded the pages back into the Bible and carried the book with her when she left. The pillar stood in the empty cabin through 3 more decades, charging and discharging through winter after winter with the indifference of something that did not require witnesses to do what it did. The grandson who demolished the cabin in 1952 had grown up in a house with a furnace and radiators and knew the pillar by family description rather than by personal memory of its function. He was 40 years old, practical, and he dismantled the structure with a respect owed to something his family had spoken of across his entire life without fully understanding himself what the reverence was grounded in. When the pillar came apart, the courses dismantled in reverse of the orders they had been laid 63 years earlier. The granite pieces were heavy and dense and close-grained in the specific way Carl had selected them for each one, carrying the faint discoloration from decades of thermal cycling. The stone surface slightly different in character from unheated granite in a way that anyone who knew what to look for could identify. He set most of the stones along the fence line of the property. One he carried to his truck without deciding why a piece from the middle section of the pillar, flat-faced, weighing perhaps 30 pounds, showing the smooth finish Carl had produced with careful dressing before mortaring it into the third course from the floor. He drove home with it in the truck bed and set it on the porch and looked at it for several days before moving it inside. He gave the family Bible to his daughter that same year and told her that her great-grandmother had left pages inside it and that the pages were in German and he had never had them properly translated. His daughter, who was 23 and had studied languages at a state college, translated them over 2 evenings and brought them back to her father in a handwritten English copy on 3 sheets of paper. He read the translation in his kitchen. His wife watched him read it and waited and saw his expression change somewhere in the second page into something she had not seen before, not grief exactly, and not pride, but the particular quality of a person discovering that something they had been given was much more than they had understood when they received it. The letter did not describe construction principles or thermal mass or the geometry of heat distribution. It described a boy named Peter who had slept in a far corner in Germany on a February night and not woken up. It described what a 12-year-old girl had understood standing in a doorway in the morning. It described 3 decades of marriage to a man who built what his father had taught him, without knowing yet that his wife did not need the argument that she had understood the point of it before the first stake went into the ground, because she had been carrying since childhood the precise knowledge of what happened in a far corner when the fire had no memory. The letter's last lines in Marta's careful script, rendered into English by her granddaughter's careful hand, they called it wasted space. They said stone cannot hold heat through the night. But 3,000 pounds remembers what 300 forgets, and Carl built what his father gave him. And I stood beside him because I already knew the cost of a far corner and a dead fire. And every morning of our winters, I pressed my palm against warm granite and felt that it remembered, and in every corner of our home, the warmth was the same, and no corner was abandoned, and no one in it was left to the cold. The stone from the pillar sits on the mantelpiece in a family home in Creek, Colorado, in the room where the furnace runs through winter, and the house holds at its temperature with electronic thermostats and insulated ductwork, and the accumulated thermal engineering of a century and a half of improvement. The stone holds no heat now. It is the temperature of the room it occupies, indistinguishable in its coolness from everything else on the shelf beside it. But in the family that inherited it, there is a habit that passes from generation to generation without formal instruction. On nights when the temperature drops past what the Weather Service classifies as severe, past the threshold where the cold stops being a season and becomes a presence, someone in the house will walk to the mantelpiece and rest a hand on that flat-faced piece of granite that stood at the center of a one-room cabin for 63 winters. The stone is cool. It has been cool for 70 years. They hold their hand against it anyway. They are remembering what it remembered. They are standing in a far corner and finding it warm.